I first met Eleanor over 20 years ago when I arrived at her church to be her new pastor. And I remember that day as if it was just yesterday, how she greeted me with warmth and had this amazing, joyful attitude, a smile, a welcoming presence, one of the most joyful people I've met in my life. And I just assumed because of who she was and how she was always helping people with a smile, that she must have had a pretty easy life. You can imagine my surprise when Eleanor told me about some of the deep and tragic grief that she had experienced before I had met her. She told me about the day when the police officers arrived at her door and let her know that her daughter had died. And to me, that has got to be one of the worst nightmares that any of us would ever experience, having a child die. But in Eleanor's case, it was even worse than that because her daughter was brutally murdered at a rest stop where she was on her way home and pulled off to use the restroom, and her body left there by the car. And the grief that she must have experienced from that was just beyond my realm of comprehension. She then told me about her husband who never got over it. In fact, he soon died of a broken heart. He was in such grief over his daughter's death that he just kept sinking further and further into darkness. The depression just kept pulling him until he died, and she was with him the whole way, experiencing that grief with him. And then on top of that, her son, her only other child, around that time they found out that he was very ill and needed an organ transplant, but he was way down the list of the recipient list for an organ and was so close to death month after month after month. And when I think of Eleanor, I'm amazed that she was able, with all the grief that she had in her life, to still have that warmth and that kindness and that joy. And I remember asking her when she shared this with me in her home, her husband, and she invited me over for dinner. And I remember just saying, Eleanor, you're one of the most joyful, helpful, gracious persons I've ever met in my life. How do you remain like that amongst all the grief that you have experienced in your life? It's far more than any of us can even imagine. And she said something like this to me. She said, Alan, I had to choose a way through my grief. And as I watched my husband die of bitterness, and part of it was the grief that he experienced from the loss of his daughter, but also the anger towards the murderer. She said, I watched that, and I watched him destroy his life, and that wasn't helpful for him or me or anybody else around us. And she said, I knew that I could make a choice to deal with my grief in a different kind of way. And I know that other people out there in the world have suffered grief like I have. And so I just decided I need to work through the grief, not ignore it, not pretend like it's not there, but I need to work through it and know that there's hope and that there's joy on the other side and that God is with me, and there's comfort in that knowledge of God's presence, and I can actually bring that to other people. And that's what she did. For the rest of her life, as far as I know, I've lost touch with her over the years, but she was one of those remarkable people who had experienced amazing, deep grief and sadness and was able to not only embrace it, but to find God in the midst of it all, knowing that on the other side of that, there is grace, there is kindness, there's comfort, and there's compassion for others. I've often thought about Eleanor, thought about the grief that she's experienced in her life, and I know that so many other people have experienced deep sadness and grief for many reasons. In fact, I know, looking around the congregation, that some of you have experienced deep grief, things that we wouldn't wish on our worst enemies. And yet, we know people like this who have been able to work through it. And one of the things that I've learned through reading this week's scripture lessons is that grief is something that seems to permeate our lives. It's not just an unusual thing that a few people experience. It's something that's a part of life, and it was a part of life in the days of the Old Testament. It was a part of Jesus' life, and throughout the New Testament. Grief seems to just permeate all of our lives and all of our families. As we read Psalm 6 this morning, think about these words while I read just a little part of that back to you. This is King David speaking as he's contemplating his own death and the death of people around him, many who died in battle. I am weary with my moaning. Every night, I flood my bed with tears. I drench my couch with my weeping. My eyes waste away because of grief. They grow weak because of all my foes. I'm guessing most of us have been there before, at some point or another, and I know for some of you, even recently, where the tears just flow and you wonder when they're going to stop. And they show up unexpectedly. And you know what? Sometimes you just can't get to sleep, and you're tired, and all you want is just to sleep. And you can't. The hope in this passage for me is that King David had no fear of coming before God with his grief. He was able to let it out, knowing that God and also the people around him could handle his grief. He didn't hold back. He was able to grieve openly and articulately. And you know what? God seemed to be able to handle it just fine. I hope when we experience our grief that we have that same freedom when we come before God, knowing that God can handle whatever our emotions are, whatever the deep grief is that we might be experiencing at the moment, and there's no reason to be embarrassed or afraid to let it out before God. I also have been talking to a few people about grief lately, the grief that they've been experiencing. And I've also been thinking a lot about how important it is to share our grief with one another. Sometimes we just like to keep that inside and say, well, it's personal. And I know we're all different in that way. When I think about my mother and my father, Mom tended just to let everything out without any filter. There it is. That's how she's feeling, and we all knew it. Dad, on the other hand, really kept just about everything inside. But I know that he experienced some grief in his life, and I know that we all deal with that differently. But I hope we never feel guilty or fearful when we express our emotions in any way that comes naturally to us. Hold on to those words from Psalm 6 the next time you're weeping, maybe even sobbing uncontrollably and unable to sleep. King David and so many others throughout the scriptures wept. Even Jesus wept. And then as we move on to the first gospel reading in Luke chapter 22, we have this scene where Jesus is anticipating his suffering and death. He knows it's just about to come. And what we're told in the scriptures is that his sweat is like drops of blood. And some people have interpreted that Jesus actually sweated blood, but what the scriptures in Luke actually say, it was like that. Just great drops were probably dripping from his face and maybe every other part of his body. He was anticipating something happening that was the greatest loss in his life, not only his own life, but his separation from his disciples, the people that he loved the most. When Jesus asked his disciples to pray, who were experiencing their own grief, he left them, it says in the scriptures, about a stone's throw away, so they could see him if they wanted to. He could see them. They weren't that far away, but when Jesus came back after his prayer, they were asleep. And what Luke tells us, they were asleep because of their grief. And it occurred to me that grief comes to us in such unexpected ways that we can't plan for. For some people, and at sometimes, you just can't sleep at all. The disciples, on the other hand, were sound asleep. And I know that that's how grief sometimes also lands on us, where all you can do is sleep. You can barely drag yourself out of bed, maybe to go to the bathroom, but that's about it. You don't want to eat. You don't want to talk to anybody. You just want to sleep. And as you read through the scriptures, you realize that grief lands on people in so many different ways. And I don't mean just different people in different ways, but on the same person. Sometimes you can sleep and you want to get up and do something, but you can't. Sometimes it's just the opposite. And one thing that I've learned about grief in my own life and being with people in grief is you can't plan on how it's going to land on you. You might be able to sleep, you might not be able to. You might be starving all the time, you might not want to eat for days. You might want to be around people and surround yourself with people, or you might just want to be alone for a long time. And you know what? There's nothing wrong with any of that. Grief comes to us in so many ways, and we respond to it in so many ways based upon who we are and what our needs are, how God has created us to be. The disciples were in deep grief knowing what was about to come, and what we know from Luke 22, which we just read, they actually were not only in grief because of what was coming, but right after this conversation with them, the next actual thing that happened was Judas showed up with the police, the authorities, and kissed Jesus on the cheek. Jesus was arrested. And if the disciples were in such grief before that they couldn't even keep their eyes open for 10 minutes, imagine the grief they must have been just about to experience watching Jesus, their Savior, their Messiah, their best friend, suffer incredibly, be tortured actually, and then to die. He was their hope. Their grief was just unimaginable for them. And yet, it's amazing to me that Jesus, in that same chapter, met with them around a table in order to prepare them for that grief. And at that table, he talked about bread being his body and the cup of wine being his blood, and inviting them to share it amongst each other. In other words, to share in his grief, his suffering, his loss, but also knowing in some mysterious way that Jesus, even after he was gone, would always be with them. Doesn't really make sense to me still, even after all these years of being a Christian and being in ministry. How can Jesus be in these elements, the bread and the wine? But I do believe in some mysterious way that these elements represent the fact that Jesus, in mystery, continues to be with us, even in our most profound moments of grief when it doesn't feel like it at all. Even during those times where you say, like the psalmist and like Jesus, my God, why have you forsaken me? What did I deserve to do that, to have this happen to me? The message of Holy Communion and of the scriptures that we read this morning is God remains in love with you no matter what, even if you don't feel like it at all. And then the final scripture that we read this morning is from Matthew chapter 5, where Jesus said, "Blessed are those who mourn." In other words, blessed are those people who experience deep sadness, unimaginable grief. And I think it's so important that we hear those words, because when we're in the midst of grief, we don't feel very blessed, do we? We feel just the opposite, that perhaps God has even left us. God has taken the blessing away from us. But Jesus assures his disciples, and possibly the crowd around the disciples that are listening at the time, that, you know what, when you feel like God is far from you, that doesn't change where God is. God is still right inside you, right with you, and all around you. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Now, the verse before that is, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Matthew tells us, as the gospel writer, that these are the first words out of Jesus' mouth in his public ministry after he's gathered his disciples together. We don't really know what the first words out of Jesus' mouth were because Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all say things a little bit differently. But according to Matthew, it was so important that people knew that these may have been the first things that Jesus said. And if you think about the poor in spirit, those who mourn, what are some of the things that come to your mind? I think of sadness. I think of abandonment, sometimes even despair or hopelessness. And the Gospel of Matthew, when you read it in its entirety, is speaking to all those people that feel like that most of the time. And the message of the Beatitudes and all of the rest of Matthew's Gospel is, you know what? It doesn't matter whether you're right here in the center of things in your society, in your culture, or on the furthest margins away from that. God blesses you. God has given you a blessing. And as we think about the times in our lives where God seemed far away and maybe even continues to seem far away, the promise is God is here among us. And the communion table is really our memory, our remembrance of that. That is still the case. And Christians not only believe that about ourselves, but about all the people that are outside these walls. And just as Jesus came and blessed people that didn't feel very blessed, that's our job too. You know who some of those people are. You probably see some of those people on a regular basis, and I'm sure you see them on the news as well. Our job as followers of Jesus is to share the blessings that we have with others and to remind them that they are blessed. No one is abandoned by God. And I don't care if you think somebody deserves to be abandoned by God, they're still not. Because the people that Matthew was addressing in John chapter 5 were told, it's your fault that you're in the predicament you are. That was the general sense with people who were mourning, people who were poor in spirit, people who were meek. All the people that are described in the Beatitudes, the current way of thinking and what they were told was, all of you that feel so abandoned by God, it's because you've done something wrong. Or perhaps you were born into the wrong family or the color of your skin or whatever. But the point of Jesus in Matthew chapter 5 is absolutely not. You're not abandoned by God. And just get it out of your head if you think you've done something to deserve to be abandoned by God. In many seminaries today, professors talk about the importance of using inclusive language. Not always referring to God in masculine terms, for example. Making sure that people understand that God has masculine qualities, feminine qualities, all different kinds of ways of thinking about God. But I do remind you that in the Gospels, Jesus did say, our Father. And he talked about his father a lot, and it makes me think that he must have had a really good relationship with Joseph when he was a child. When I think of what fatherhood means to me and what parenthood means to many of you, you know that you would never abandon your child or take your blessing away from your child, no matter how much they mess up. There's a reason in that culture that Jesus always referred to God, over and over again anyway, as Father. If we can just get it into our minds that that's how God really thinks of us, I frankly think that most of the problems in the world would just disappear. Especially if we started treating everybody else like that. In just a moment, we're going to celebrate Holy Communion, and the children are going to come in a moment. In our church, our tradition is to allow the children to come first. And one of the reasons I really like that is because the children, when they come, they haven't really proven themselves as Christians necessarily. They just come as children who want to participate in Jesus' presence within the community of disciples of Jesus. And the children come with their innocence, and it reminds me that we don't have to prove anything for God's favor, for God's blessing, for God's love. I hope as you prepare your hearts for communion today, that you will think of the children that come in just a moment and remind yourselves that God always thinks of us in that same way. And some are already ready for communion. Let's pause for just a moment in silence as we begin Holy Communion.